Chapter 1. The Three Travelers at the Oaks of Mamre. A cruel, white-hot silence reigned over Mamre, broken only occasionally by the crackle of dry grass under the weight of the unbearable heat. The midday sun, resembling a copper shield, hung at its zenith, mercilessly burning the gray air and melting the contours of the world, transforming them into a shimmering, deceptive mirage. Abraham, the patriarch, an octogenarian master of a large flock, and an equally profound, though unexpressed, sorrow, sat at the entrance of his tent. He was neither sleeping nor working. He was waiting. His gaze was fixed on the infinite, where his life, his faith, and his grand, yet barren, promise intersected with the horizon. The oaks of Mamre, ancient, mighty witnesses to his faith, cast the only shadow that offered refuge. This was not just a place, it was an altar where he formed his thoughts into prayer. Abraham reflected on the past, on the relentless flight of time that left him sonless, on Sarah's quiet, yet daily, reproach, and on their shared, parched life. He was alone in this contemplation, when suddenly, at the very edge of his vision, where the mirage trembled most intensely, they appeared. Not four, not two. There were three figures. They did not approach like weary, sun-scorched travelers seeking shelter. They arose, and their silhouettes shimmered in the haze, as if not reflecting light, but emitting it, like the flares of an unearthly fire of a different nature. Each step seemed not an effort, but an act of will that curtailed space. Abraham's old heart, weathered by years and hardened by faith, which daily anticipated the miracle, immediately sensed. These were no ordinary men. In their posture, in the strict rhythm of their movement, in the way they silently and commandingly held the space around them, there was something supernatural. It was the incursion of eternity into the temporary. This was not a journey, but a manifestation. Abraham, seized not by fear, but by a trembling reverence that penetrated the very essence of his being, quickly rose. In that moment, he ceased to be the patriarch, the head of a great family. He became a servant, a humble, devoted attendant before the face of his master. His aged body, which a minute ago had felt the burden of years, gained an unprecedented lightness. He ran toward them, a run that was a gesture worthy of a king meeting his sovereign. He bowed low, touching the scorching dust with his forehead, and uttered the words that became the golden standard of hospitality. But in his mouth, they sounded like a sacred liturgy. Lord, if I have found favor in your eyes, do not pass your servant by. In the word Lord, Adonai, was concentrated all his faith, all his pain, and all his hope. He did not know who among them was the chief, but his soul unerringly identified the will standing behind them. His invitation was not a request, but a plea worthy of being heard. Rest in the shade, water, for their feet to wash away the dust that symbolizes the world, and bread to fortify the soul, to restore the connection between body and spirit. It was a holistic ritual of renewal. Abraham did not wait for an answer. Having received silent, dignified consent, he plunged into the whirlpool of service, and in this service, he found oblivion from his lifelong impotence. Every movement was swift, determined, full of energy, as if he were trying to redeem all 24 years of his impatient waiting. He spoke to Sarah, and in his voice was such unaccustomed, authoritative urgency that she, perennially resigned to her status as a childless woman, could not argue. Sarah, whose life until now was measured only by years of barrenness, suddenly felt her daily routine acquire cosmic significance. She, Sarah, kneaded the dough, preparing cakes, the simplest of foods, but today this food was to become the meal of God. Every movement of her hands, mixing flour and water, was filled with the tension of mystery. Abraham himself hurried to the herd. His choice was not accidental. He did not simply take an animal. He selected the finest calf, young, tender, a symbol of purity and the greatest sacrifice. This was sacrificial hospitality. He commanded his servant to prepare it, and the servant, sensing the patriarch's quiet yet unbreakable tension, worked with double diligence. The air, which a minute ago was only saturated with suffocating heat, was now filled with an aroma, the sweetish scent of roasted meat, the substantial, earthy spirit of fresh bread baking on hot stones, and the cool, refreshing sourness of milk. This aroma was the olfactory map of Abraham's world. Earth, food, life. The three strangers sat under the wide-spreading oak, their shadows short and sharp, as if carved in stone. They consumed the meal not in haste, but with a dignified, calm deliberation. Abraham stood beside them. He did not sit. He did not eat. He stood as the guardian on the boundary, a figure torn between two worlds, the world of his duties and the world of absolute mystery. His heart pounded not from physical exertion, but from the psychological tension of the moment. He was waiting not for thanks, but for a word. For his faith was not in the bread, but in the word that was about to be spoken. Every minute of this silent meal was an eternity filled with the anticipation that the most important was yet to come. Chapter 2. The promise of a son. The silence under the oak of Mamre was thick as honey and heavy as lead. It was filled not only with the aromas of the fresh meal, but also with an unspoken, overwhelming presence. Abraham stood as if cast in bronze, his gaze fixed on the three travelers, whose faces, bathed in unearthly light, seemed to see not him, but his destiny. And then, this silence was severed like a razor blade by a sharp, unexpected, piercing word. It belonged to one of them, he whose gaze was so pure and deep that it penetrated not merely clothes or skin, but through 24 years of vain hopes directly into the withered heart of the patriarch. "Where is Sarah, your wife?" the voice inquired. This was no mere question. It was a summoning. It was the act of bringing the woman who hid in the shadow of her barrenness into the light of divine attention. Abraham, still stunned, could only reply, pointing to the tent. There, in the tent. And then the promise sounded. It was uttered with such simplicity, such everyday certainty, that its cosmic weight seemed unbearable. "I will surely return to you about this time next year, and Sarah your wife will have a son." The words hung in the air. About this time next year, not perhaps, not if you try hard, but will have. It was a decree, but a decree filled with the highest grace. For Abraham, these words were like an electric shock that ran through his aged veins, reminding him that he was not just a master of the flock, but a partner in the divine plan. His face, weathered by desert winds, for the first time in years smoothed out into an expression of pure, unadulterated awe. But there was another, the one whose life had been defined by emptiness. Sarah stood behind the tent flap. She stood like a shadow, hidden in the inner cozy world where she could mourn her childless life. She listened. Her hearing was stretched to the limit, for she knew that in the presence of such guests, not only Abraham's fate, but her own was being decided. When the words about a son were spoken, her heart, which had long turned into a dry stone, could not bear it. It did not burst into joy. It laughed. It was not a laugh of merriment. It was a bitter, sarcastic laugh of despair that hid in her chest and was barely audible even to herself. It was her body's protest against divine logic. After I am worn out, shall I have pleasure? She thought, and this thought was permeated with the poison of self-abasement. And my Lord is old also. She imagined herself, wrinkled, powerless, almost turned to dust. And him, Abraham, whose faith had not faded, but whose body was equally spent. This laugh was a psychological reflection of her internal breakdown. She rejected the possibility of a miracle because human reality, with its merciless laws of age and biology, was harder for her than heaven. But the voice, speaking through the traveler, proved to be stronger than the tent fabric and mightier than the rock of her doubt. It was a direct invasion of her consciousness into her most private, unspoken world. Why did Sarah laugh? The word was not merely a question. It was a reproach, but a reproach wrapped in divine gentleness. The voice knew her thought, her laugh, her deep, cemented disappointment. At that moment, Sarah understood that there was nowhere left to hide. Following this question, which shook the foundations of her world, came the culmination: is anything too hard for the Lord? These words were a cosmic challenge. They were not intended to shame her, but to break down the wall of her human limitation. They offered her to exchange her old, dried-up reality for an infinite, incomprehensible possibility. Sarah, terrified to the core, rushed out of the tent. Her face was pale, her eyes wide. She instinctively, like a child caught in the act, denied. "I did not laugh." Her words were a lie, dictated not by malice, but by the hellish fear that her most intimate thoughts had been exposed. She feared not punishment, but the closeness of God. But the Lord looked at her with a gentleness that surpassed all fear. In his eyes there was no anger, only majestic, compassionate truth. "No, but you did laugh." In those 4 simple words, there was no rebuke. There was only certainty, which disarmed and paralyzed. It was a confirmation of her distrust, but at the same time, it was the seal of the future miracle. She could laugh at him, but he did not laugh at her. On the contrary, he knew her weakness, her pain, and still offered her a gift. In that moment, standing under the scorching midday sun, Sarah, though trembling, felt a premonition of a miracle begin to blossom in the depths of her dried-up old faith. It was no longer a hope. It was a promise, sanctified by the direct, piercing word of God himself. The laughter of despair died, and in its place was born a fragile, like the first shoots of spring, but indestructible hope. She retreated back into the tent, but it was a different Sarah now, a woman who was no longer hiding from life, but preparing to receive it. Chapter 3. The revelation of God's judgment on Sodom. When the last crumbs of bread were eaten, and the oaks of Mamre once again sank into suffocating silence, time seemed to resume its course, but it was no longer the same time. The just completed meal left behind not only the scent of meat and fresh bread, but also a feeling of deep, incomprehensible connection. The 3 travelers rose. It was an act filled with unseen, yet absolute authority, marking the end of hospitality and the beginning of a higher purpose. Their gazes were fixed on the east, toward the valley of Sodom, where, amidst the lush greenery watered by the Jordan, the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah flourished. symbols of human arrogance, prosperity without God, and moral decay. Abraham could not simply stand still. His heart, just warmed by the promise of a son, was again filled with trembling. He walked beside them, escorting them. This was not merely a polite stroll, but a symbolic boundary where the light of God's presence touched the edge of sinful civilization. Abraham walked between the human and the divine, in the role of a faithful servant, a witness, and a friend. And then, when they had moved away from the tents, and Sarah could no longer hear, the voice spoke again. It was the voice that created worlds, but now it sounded in a confidential, almost intimate conversation with the only person on earth who believed him, without reservation. Shall I hide from Abraham what I am about to do? For he shall surely become a great and mighty nation, and in him all the nations of the earth shall be blessed. This was not rhetoric, but a theological manifesto. The Lord explained that his relationship with Abraham was now based not only on obedience, but also on shared knowledge and partnership. Abraham was chosen not just to father a nation. He was chosen to be the source of blessing and a moral standard for the entire world. How could the act of universal judgment be concealed from the one through whom blessing was to come? The wind accompanying them suddenly brought not only the heat of the desert, but also a bitter, unpleasant odor, though the land still rested in silence. It was the smell of moral decay, which seemed to permeate the very earth. One of the two who carried the aura of judgment spoke, and in his voice there was no passion, only a majestic, unyielding necessity. The outcry against Sodom and Gomorrah is so great, and their sin is so grievous. The words were heavy as lead slabs. The outcry meant that evil had reached the heavens, that it had become so loud and so unbearable that it demanded immediate, inevitable intervention. This was not the cry of victims, but the cry of sin itself, tearing apart the cosmic harmony. The sin of Sodom was not merely a violation of law. It was a spiritual infection that threatened the very concept of morality and hospitality. And then, on the edge of the horizon, came the moment of separation. The two men, who were the angels of judgment, went further to the east to become the instruments of inevitability. And the third, the Lord himself, remained. He stayed to speak with Abraham. The silence that stretched between them was no longer the silence of hospitality, but the silence of majestic revelation. Abraham felt the weight of the impending catastrophe settle upon his aged shoulders. His heart, filled with love for all people, for Lot, his nephew, was there in Sodom, trembled. He stood before the Creator not as a petitioner, but as the advocate for humanity, as the first great intercessor in history. His soul sensed that he was called not only to become the father of many, but also the voice of mercy at the moment of ultimate judgment. He had to speak, despite his fear, because his right to intercede had been granted by the Lord himself. Chapter 4. Abraham and the intercession for the righteous. This was a moment of theological duel, the grandest, riskiest conversation in history. Abraham, a man of dust and ashes, stood before the Lord, whose voice created the heavens. He stood not as a thoughtless slave, but as one who comprehended mercy and law, and now dared to contradict the logic of judgment. "Will you indeed sweep away the righteous with the wicked?" Abraham asked. And in his voice trembled not only love for Lot, his nephew, but also a deep, universal sense of justice. He could not imagine that, Divine perfection would allow such a morally absurd situation to occur. His question was a challenge not to God's authority, but to his nature. Abraham dared to enter the bargain of mercy. It was a game on the brink of life and death, and the stakes were extraordinarily high. Not only the fates of cities, but Abraham's trust in the moral perfection of his God. The first number was substantial, but relatively safe. Suppose there are 50 righteous within the city. Will you then sweep away the place? Abraham understood that 50 was the minimum critical mass for a city. And the Lord, with a majestic calmness that underscored the depth of his mercy, agreed. If I find in Sodom 50 righteous people, I will spare the whole place for their sake. The answer was a confirmation. Mercy exists. But Abraham's heart, prompted by the Holy Spirit and the knowledge of human sinfulness, did not rest. He realized that 50 was too many. He had to lower the stake. It was time for the second, bolder step. Abraham, taking a breath, as if preparing for a leap into the abyss, said, "Behold, I have undertaken to speak to the Lord, I who am but dust and ashes. Suppose 5 of the 50 righteous are lacking. Will you destroy the whole city for lack of 5? His words were filled with self-abasement, dust and ashes, and simultaneously cosmic audacity. The answer was immediate. I will not destroy it if I find 45 there. Abraham now felt within him the fierce, relentless energy of intercession. This was no longer just a request. It was a battle for every soul. When the Lord readily agreed to 40, Abraham's heart clenched with a premonition. If he agrees so easily, then perhaps not even that many are in the city. Oh, let not the Lord be angry, and I will speak. Suppose 30 are found there. I will not destroy it if I find 30 there. Each step, each descent in number, was a step closer to the abyss of truth. Abraham had crossed the line. He was fighting not against God, but for the idea of God as the highest mercy. He repeatedly lowered the threshold, as if hoping that somewhere, at the final frontier, he could find the necessary minimum for salvation. Suppose 20 are found there. I will not destroy it for the sake of 20. The tension was unbearable. Only one, final, most desperate number remained. Abraham closed his eyes. His voice must have barely trembled as he uttered his final, risky plea. Oh, let not the Lord be angry, and I will speak just once more. Suppose 10 are found there. He knew this was his last chance. 10 is the minimum for a gathering, for a community, for a quorum. If even 10 righteous people could not be found in these cities, their sinfulness was not just high, it was total. And the Lord, concluding this majestic liturgy of mercy, replied in the same soft, majestic voice, I will not destroy it for the sake of 10. When that word sounded, it was the final act of divine patience. The Lord ended his conversation. He showed that mercy has a limit, but this limit is determined by the presence of even the minimum number of righteousness. When silence fell upon the earth again, it was heavier than any words. Abraham bowed his head, not in despair, but in deep, bitter understanding. He had done everything he could. He could not see what would happen next, but he knew, in God's judgment, there is no arbitrariness, but a precise measure of mercy, measured by human righteousness. The Lord departed, and Abraham was left alone with his faith, which had just passed the severest test, the test of compassion and intercession. Chapter 3. The silence of hope and the shadow of judgment. When the Lord departed, leaving the patriarch alone with himself and the endless wilderness, the silence that fell over Mamre was physically palpable. It was not merely the absence of sound, but a vacuum left after the withdrawal of the divine presence. Abraham stood in the place where they had spoken, and his aged body suddenly felt incredible weariness. He was emotionally exhausted by this monumental conversation, this struggle for 10 souls. His mission as intercessor was complete. He was dismissed. He returned to his camp. The sun was already sinking, and the sky began to be painted in restless, troubled colors, orange, crimson, as if reflecting the coming fire over the valley of Sodom. Abraham could not eat. He felt the shadow of judgment hanging over the world, and he, as the only person privy to this terrible secret, bore its burden. Sarah, the woman shadow, emerged from her tent. She stood at the entrance, her gaze fixed on the horizon, where the trinity of travelers had vanished. She did not know about Sodom, had not heard the outcry of sin, but she knew something else. She had heard the promise. Her consciousness had been completely reformatted by that single, gentle, yet authoritative revelation. No, but you did laugh. Sarah no longer felt bitterness. Her face, wrinkled but illuminated by an inner light, was filled with quiet, trembling hope. Her former laughter was the laughter of skepticism. Now she awaited the laughter of joy, the laughter that would name her future son. All these years, she had lived with the feeling that God had forgotten her personally, that he had chosen only Abraham. But now she understood. The Lord entered her tent, into her most intimate thoughts, to say that he knew of her pain, her age, her despair, and that is why he was giving her a son. This was no compromise, as with Hagar. This was a personal, profound triumph. She looked at Abraham. Her husband, her Lord, seemed to be in a trance, absorbed by the grandeur of what he had just experienced. She sensed that he knew something terrible. But now she was ready for any terrible news, because her personal future was engraved by the Word of God himself. That evening, when the trinity of angels of judgment had already reached the gates of Sodom, and a heavy, pre-storm silence hung over the valley of Sodom, Abraham and Sarah stood side by side. They did not speak of Sodom and Gomorrah. They spoke of the new, marvelous possibility of life. Their past, decades of barrenness, human mistakes with Hagar, constant, nagging doubt, suddenly seemed distant and insignificant. In their hearts, a hope, a small but indestructible flame, now glowed, lit by a direct divine spark. This hope was fragile, for it was born not of physical strength, but of transcendent revelation. It demanded patience, but no longer demanded blind, unreasoning obedience. It was a conscious, joyful readiness to accept the impossible. Sarah, this old yet renewed woman, stood beneath the stars, which seemed closer and brighter. Her face was turned toward heaven. She awaited not merely childbirth. She awaited the culmination of her faith, the moment when she could hold her son and name him Isaac. Laughter. A laughter that would no longer be bitter, but would become the joyous affirmation of God's faithfulness. And while Abraham mourned the inevitable fate of Sodom, Sarah lived in the silence of anticipation, where the fear of sin and judgment was overcome by the premonition of a personal, unprecedented miracle.